How did people survive the winter in the Middle Ages? The winter here in Europe is really no joke, even today. And even with modern heating and grocery stores, it still can be very hard. But how did people survive it in the Middle Ages? For information, the Middle Ages lasted from 500 to 1500 AD. Surviving the winter was a significant challenge, especially for the lower classes. We will start with the winter clothing. The concept of winter shoes was non-existent, even though people always had been creative. A lot of shoes were made of leather and filled with fur, wool or felt, but not everyone could afford shoes like that. There are paintings that show shoes made of straw. 3-finger gloves were in trend as they provided the grip that was needed for the daily work and kept the hand warmer than 5-finger gloves actually do, so they were pretty smart. The clothes in general were stuffed with fur. Outside they were made of colorful textiles and inside they were coated with fur of any animal that was available for the individual. And for the poorer ones, layering with everything they had was also really common. Actually, a lot of paintings don't show particular winter clothing, rather the same as they used in summertime. But knowing the winter here in Germany, I cannot imagine that this was enough. When it comes to food, meat was considered the most nutrient-dense food and was highly valuable. Even if it was expensive, a lot of people tried to save some for their winter survival. In the late summer and autumn, pigs were fed in the forests, which was a cheap way to provide food for them. The reason why pig meat was so popular in Europe was that pigs are not really picky eaters and were therefore cheap to feed. And the reason why almost all countries in Europe have their signature sausage was because making sausages out of meat was the best way to preserve it, sometimes all year long. If we take a look at Italian salami or prosciutto, those can be preserved for 1 or even 2 years. Everything of the animal was used, from blood to the bones for broth. Nothing got wasted. But of course, it was not always available or for some not affordable. If people ran out of pig meat, hunting small animals or birds with traps was common. Large game was reserved for the nobility, so poorer people had to rely on hunting smaller creatures. When peasants were caught hunting for bigger animals, they would risk severe penalties like cutting off their finger or even hand, whipping or paying a lot of money. And that was because the forests belonged to the nobility. The repeated hunting for deer could even bring the death penalty. Another important basic foods were winter vegetables like cabbage, winter spinach, onion or carrots. They were harvested and later fermented to make them last the whole winter and also to make them more digestible. That was the time where the famous sauerkraut had its peak. Fermentation, salting, drying, pickling, cooking skills in general were essential to survive. That was also the reason why being married was so crucial. Having a wife was a real treasure to a man, as she did the winter preparation while the husband was at work. Women learned those skills from an early age on, while boys were prepared to hard labor. But only together they could more or less safely survive those brutal winters. Of course, grains were also necessary. Even in the winter times, it was sown because so-called winter grains brought more harvest than summer grains. That means that farmers couldn't rest in the winter period, but had to work sometimes twice as hard than in the summertime. What made the situation particularly hard was that about 1/3 of the harvest had to be given to the landowner and another third was reserved for the next sowing season. So the grain stock has to be kept in control. How that was made, for example, is by baking bread but never eating it fresh out of the oven. I actually learned that in a bread museum. Bread was kept at least 1 day or up to a week because warm bread was so delicious that the people couldn't stop to eat it. When the bread got hard instead, 1 slice was enough to stop the hunger. But not only food supplies had to be prepared. Firewood was especially important for survival. Even back then, there were almost no primeval forests left. Instead, most forests were managed ones, meaning they were cultivated. These forests already had to be protected by the forest laws, because people had been cutting trees down carelessly since ages. Wood was a vital resource and could become very expensive. During winter, people often had to spend up to half of their monthly income on firewood, unless they collected small branches themselves every day. This was especially common among the poor and also a task for children. To keep the dark away, additional money had to be spent on candles. The rich could afford wax candles, while the lower classes used candles made from tallow, which is animal fat. These tallow candles smelled like freshly roasted meat when lit, so you can imagine that many medieval rooms smelled of fried fat. In Germany, larger houses or even castles had rooms called Stuben, which is an equivalent for heated rooms that were covered in wood. These were easier to heat with a tiled stove and held the warmth relatively well. Some were even built in a way that allowed 1 stove to heat 2 rooms. Still, it was completely normal to keep wearing your winter clothes while sitting in a heated room. Families slept together in 1 room, keeping each other warm. Many day laborers were unemployed during the winter, such as those who worked in vineyards or on construction sites. However, even back then, cities were well organized enough to distribute help to the poor, such as providing them with bread and lard. In general, most people had less money in winter, even those not affected by unemployment, such as craftsmen. Winter days are shorter, which meant there was less usable daylight. People had to plan wisely and make the most of the summer and autumn to stockpile enough items for winter. The winter was used for repairing things at home. New tools were also developed for use in the summer. Wood carving was a popular and useful hobby. And to keep themselves warm and relatively clean, visiting bathing houses was popular. Those were heated houses with several bathing tubes where you would get bathed professionally and could enjoy some chats with your fellow bathing friend. Going there 1 or 2 times a month was the minimum of a regular peasant. But those who could afford it surely went there more often. There you would get peelings, massages, steam treatments, and afterwards get scented oils on your body. Hair and beard cutting was done there, even teeth treatments. The job of a professional bather included many medical treatments in general. And if needed, lice were also removed there. Every city had several of those bathing houses. Some of them had also in there. Even in my little village in Germany, there was a bathing house. So yes, the winter in medieval times were hard. But it's still hard today. Many people need our help during the winter season, and if you can afford to give something to a struggling person in that period, feel free to do it. In some 100 years, people will wonder how we survived the winter. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you again in the next one. If you like, you can also check out my shorts as well.